Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage, excellent for aspiring writers. If you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps guide our future content.
And just to set the stage, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Right, so to kick things off today, I want you to picture something. Just imagine you are standing face to face with the very first humans.
Oh, wow. Okay. Going way back.
Yeah, exactly. We are talking about our ancestors from like a quarter of a million years ago. They're naked, shivering in the cold, completely exposed to just a terrifying world.
Right.
And you look into their eyes, what truly separates your modern mind from theirs? I mean, it certainly is not physical strength. They probably have better hearing, a better sense of smell, much faster reflexes.
Well, yeah, they would have had to possess all of those physical advantages simply to survive another day in that brutal environment.
Exactly. So what is the defining difference between you and that ancient ancestor? It is knowledge, that invisible, cumulative architecture inside your head.
Which is pretty incredible to think about.
It is. That is the singular tool that allowed a relatively weak, hairless primate to basically conquer the Earth.
That actually brings us perfectly to our focus for today's analysis. We are conducting a summary review of Charles Van Doren's book, A History of Knowledge, Past, Present, and Future.
It's a massive topic.
It really is. So our mission here is to provide a clear, neutral walkthrough of the book's structure, its main claims, and its key examples. We are going to act as your guided tour through the text.
Right, just mapping out how humanity progressed from basic survival instincts to, eventually exploring the stars.
Exactly. And to be clear right up front, we're looking at the author's historical interpretations exactly as they are presented in the text. We're providing an objective overview of his framework, rather than arguing whether his specific lens on history is, right or wrong.
Okay, so let's unpack this. If we are going to trace the entire evolutionary history of human knowledge, we kind of have to start by defining what knowledge actually is.
Right, defining the term.
Yeah. And I love how Van Doren draws this fascinating line in the sand between what animals know and what humans know.
He frames this as the fundamental divide between particular knowledge and general knowledge. And this distinction really serves as the foundation for the entire book.
So particular knowledge, what does that look like?
It's highly specific situational awareness. Think about a squirrel. A squirrel knows that a very specific oak tree in the park has its nest.
Right, it knows that one tree.
Exactly. Or a dog learns which specific vehicles pulling into its driveway belong to its owners and which delivery trucks mean a stranger is approaching.
Okay, so if you are a primitive human operating purely on particular knowledge, you know that, say, saber-toothed cats come to a specific spring in the evening.
Yes.
So you only draw your water in the morning. It is entirely practical. It keeps you alive, but it only applies to that exact scenario.
Precisely. It is limited by those particular circumstances.
Yeah.
You cannot transfer that knowledge easily to a completely different context.
Right.
Humans, however, develop something entirely different. They develop general knowledge. This is the ability to understand broad concepts, abstract categories, and underlying causes.
It's a massive cognitive leap.
It really is. It's the leap from knowing this specific antelope died today to understanding the universal abstract truth that all living things are born, require sustenance, and will eventually die.
Or recognizing that the sun will rise every morning and set every evening, governed by this predictable system, even when heavy storm clouds obscure the sky for days.
Exactly. That is such a massive shift in processing reality. You go from merely reacting to your immediate, localized environment to recognizing universal patterns that govern the entire world.
So how does he apply this to human history?
Well, Van Doren applies this crucial distinction to his exploration of the wisdom of the ancients. That's chapter 1. He looks closely at the great early empires, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Aztecs, the Inca.
Okay, the heavy hitters.
Right. Now, these civilizations possessed breathtaking, almost unfathomable amounts of particular knowledge. Through generations of observation and trial, they developed highly sophisticated agriculture, complex metallurgy, and monumental architecture.
I mean, they built the Great Pyramids in Machu Picchu. You do not accomplish engineering feats of that magnitude without some incredibly serious know-how.
You certainly don't. But Van Doren argues that despite these towering physical achievements, they frequently lacked general abstract principles.
Really? How so?
The author uses the Inca as a prime example of this limitation. They built stunning, complex stone cities high in the unforgiving Andes Mountains. Yet despite this architectural brilliance, they never invented a written language.
That is wild.
And even more surprisingly, the book points out that they completely failed to understand the abstract concept of the lever.
Wait. No lever. How do you build an entire stone civilization without understanding the lever? That seems impossible.
Well, it comes down to the difference between practical troubleshooting and overarching theory. They could absolutely accomplish the physical task of moving massive stones using specific tools and ramps they developed through rigorous trial and error.
Ah, okay. Just brute forcing the problem through experience.
Exactly. But they did not possess the overarching mathematical or mechanical theory of leverage, the formulaic understanding of how force and distance relate.
Right.
Why does that matter? Because without the general formula, you have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, for every single unique building project.
You have to rely on tribal passed-down experience.
Yes, rather than a mathematical law that can be scaled infinitely and taught instantly to anyone. They solve specific problems brilliantly, but the general universal principle escaped them.
That makes total sense. They had the physical application, but not the mathematical blueprint.
Exactly. And we see a similar dynamic in ancient Mesopotamia. They did invent writing specifically, cuneiform, on clay tablets.
Right, the little wedge shapes.
Yeah. But initially, it was not used to record sweeping philosophies, histories, or literature. It was invented purely for administrative accounting.
Oh, really? Just for accounting?
Yes. It was a technology developed for keeping rigid records of who owned how many cows, who traded how many bolts of cloth, and who owed taxes to the central authority.
So writing was basically an administrative tool.
Purely administrative. And because the written language was so remarkably complex, requiring years of dedicated study to memorize thousands of symbols, only a microscopic fraction of the population, perhaps 1%, ever learned to read and write.
Wow, just 1%.
Yeah, and this made the scribes incredibly powerful. Van Doren notes that ancient advertisements for apprenticeships literally boasted that scribes get to sit in the shade and write, while the rest of the people had to sweat and do manual labor.
Unbelievable.
Literacy was not a tool for enlightenment. It was the ultimate path to political power and wealth.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting to me. Were ancient Mesopotamian scribes essentially the first software engineers?
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Think about it. They were this tiny, elite minority who could read the code those small black marks pressed into clay. And by controlling that code, they controlled the entire flow of society, the economy, the laws, while everyone else was completely locked out of the operating system.
It is a compelling modern parallel, but I would actually twist it a bit. Unlike modern software engineers who build programs designed to be as user-friendly as possible for the masses, these ancient scribes built and maintained systems specifically designed to keep the masses out.
Ah, right. The complexity was a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. The complexity was the point. It was a monopoly on administration. But that purely administrative approach to reality eventually hit a limit.
So what broke that limit?
To find the leap into abstract theoretical thinking, the book traces how humanity moved beyond just recording transactions and started asking fundamental questions about the nature of existence itself.
The first major intellectual explosion.
Yes. Occurring in the 6th century BC, the Greeks sparked a profound revolution in human thought. This is when humanity did not just collect isolated facts or administrative records, they invented an entirely new way of organizing information.
What do they call it?
The Greeks introduced a concept they called episteme, which translates roughly to organized public knowledge. Today, we call it science.
And what practically made episteme so different from the secret knowledge held by the Mesopotamian scribes or the Egyptian priests?
The key word there is public. Egyptian and Mesopotamian knowledge was fiercely guarded, a trade secret used by the elite to maintain control.
Like keeping the software closed source.
Exactly. The Greeks proposed that knowledge should be public, and more importantly, based on principles that could be actively tested, reviewed, debated, and questioned by other citizens.
Open source reality. I love it.
And even more profoundly than that, the Greeks introduced a revolutionary philosophical assumption. They proposed that the exterior universe and the interior human mind are a perfect fit.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning that the world is inherently rational. Because human beings possess reason, we are actually capable of understanding how nature works.
So it's not just random magic.
Right. The cosmos is not just a chaotic, unpredictable playground of fickle gods. It operates on strict logical rules, and our brains are naturally equipped to decode those exact rules.
That is a staggering level of confidence.
It was, and it fueled an unprecedented era of discovery. Van Doren highlights Aristotle as the ultimate embodiment of this systematic approach to the world.
Oh, Aristotle, the classic.
Aristotle was so deeply committed to categorizing all earthly knowledge that he actually used his former pupil, Alexander the Great, as a sort of imperial research assistant.
Hey, really? Alexander the Great?
Yes. As Alexander aggressively conquered the known world, he established logistical pipelines to send back botanical and zoological samples from distant lands for Aristotle to analyze, dissect, and classify into a grand biological hierarchy.
Alexander the Great, the most feared military conqueror of the ancient world, meticulously collecting plant and animal samples for his old teacher. You have to love that image.
It is pretty great.
It really highlights how deeply they valued expanding their understanding of the natural world.
It shows an incredible priority placed on comprehensive understanding. And in doing this work, Aristotle made a fascinating distinction about what it means to be truly educated.
Okay, what was his definition?
He differentiated between what he called a professor, which he defined as a narrow specialist deeply entrenched in one specific field, and someone with an educational acquaintance with a subject.
How does an educational acquaintance differ from being a specialist? Is it just knowing less?
Not at all. It's about the type of knowledge. Someone with an educational acquaintance might not know every single granular, highly specific detail of a field, but they understand the fundamental methodology of that field.
Ah, I see.
They are critical enough to distinguish sense from nonsense. They know how a biologist investigates a problem, how a mathematician proves a theorem, and how a rhetorician constructs an argument.
So they see the big picture.
Yes, Van Doren identifies this broad, highly critical capability as the true hallmark of the Renaissance man. It is the ability to evaluate the validity of arguments across the entire spectrum of human knowledge, rather than being siloed in one discipline.
I have to push back on something fundamental here, though. Van Doren explicitly mentions the arrogance of both the Greek and our modern knowledge explosions.
He does, yes?
Looking at this Greek foundation, isn't it profoundly arrogant to assume that the entire chaotic, infinite cosmos perfectly conforms to human logic? Why should the universe care about making mathematical sense to a bipedal primate standing on a tiny rock?
That is an excellent observation, and it highlights the central tension of the entire Greek worldview. It is a brilliant, wildly productive arrogance because that exact assumption drove them to invent advanced mathematics, geometry, and early atomic theory.
Right, they had to believe the universe was logical to go looking for its logic.
Exactly. But, as the book points out, it also led them into serious, centuries-long errors. They became so enamored with their own intellect that they often trusted their logical armchair deductions far more than they trusted empirical observation.
Ah, they assumed that if the math was elegant, reality simply had to obey it. If their logic dictated that heavy objects fall faster than light objects, they didn't actually bother to drop 2 rocks off a tower to check.
Precisely. They believed the mind was superior to the messy physical senses. And because of that blind spot, that Greek arrogance eventually stalled out.
They hit a wall.
It did. Their ideas were largely absorbed, heavily modified or suppressed by the practical engineering mindset of the Roman Empire and the subsequent medieval period.
But they weren't lost forever.
No, those foundational texts, those early attempts to map the logic of the universe, survived underground in monastic libraries and Islamic translation centers for centuries.
Just waiting for the right moment to spark a new revolution. Now, while we are on the subject of questioning how we process information and seeking deeper understanding, this is a perfect time to mention that you are listening to Mindful Moments.
A fantastic resource.
It is. It's our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques inspiring reflection and rational thought. And deep reflection is exactly what happened when those ancient texts finally resurfaced and met a changing world.
Indeed. Which brings us to the period roughly between 1550 and 1700 and the invention of the scientific method.
The second explosion?
Yes. Van Doren calls this the single most valuable kind of knowledge the West has given the world. This era fundamentally rejected the old Greek idea of relying solely on pure philosophical deduction, and it rejected the medieval reliance on ancient authority.
So what did they rely on?
It demanded rigorous physical measurement.
If you cannot measure it, if you cannot test it, it does not exist, or at least it has no place in the realm of science.
That became the rigid new standard. Galileo famously declared that the book of nature is written entirely in mathematical characters.
That's a beautiful quote.
It is. If you want to read the universe, you cannot just philosophize about its purpose. You have to learn geometry and mathematics. René Descartes took this even further.
What did he say?
He argued that the entire physical universe operates exactly like a giant, intricate machine
Mm.
governed exclusively by strict mathematical equations.
And he applied this mechanical view to living things too, didn't he?
He did, and his justification is fascinating. Descartes argued that animals are essentially complex biological machines
Wow. Biological machine.
because he believed they lacked an immaterial, rational soul. He concluded their behaviors could be entirely described and predicted by mathematical formulas.
Just input and output.
Exactly. Just as a clock ticks because of the physical arrangement of its gears and springs, Descartes believed a dog barks or a bird flies purely because of the physical arrangement of its muscles, blood, and bones functioning like pulleys and bellows.
So humans were the only exception.
In his view, yes. Only humans possessed an immaterial soul that stood outside this mechanical cause and effect framework.
That must have caused a massive collision of worldviews. You are taking a society deeply rooted in spiritual mystery and telling them the world is just a giant, unfeeling clock.
It was a monumental cultural reversal.
Yeah.
For 1,000 years leading up to this point, theology had been considered the queen of the sciences. It was the ultimate, unifying lens through which all truth was filtered.
Right.
But after figures like Descartes and eventually Isaac Newton, who actually solved the mathematical equations that perfectly describe planetary motion and gravity mathematical physics, slowly but surely edged theology out of the laboratory.
It pushed it to the margins.
Yes. The physical world was no longer seen as mysterious divine theater full of hidden meanings. It became a resolutely material place, ruled entirely by mechanical laws that humans could calculate.
So to use another analogy, it sounds like the scientific method was a literal operating system update for the human mind.
Oh, I like where this is going.
We uninstalled a philosophical and theological interface, which was focused on finding the purpose and spiritual meaning behind events, and we installed a computational interface focused purely on measurement, prediction, and mechanics.
That's a great way to put it.
And once we ran that update, we irrevocably changed how we process reality. There was no going back to the old OS.
That analogy captures the magnitude of the shift, but I would absolutely push back on the word uninstalled. We didn't completely uninstall the deeply human need for philosophy, meaning, and purpose.
Good point, yeah.
What we actually did was force a cold, computational operating system to run on hardware that was still deeply emotional and philosophical.
Which causes some glitches.
Exactly. We gained immense, unprecedented power to predict and control nature. But as Van Doren notes, treating the entire world as a machine rendered it, in many respects, a desert of the spirit.
Because you can't measure the spirit.
Mathematics is incredibly powerful, but it cannot measure immaterial things like morality, justice, or meaning.
But with this new mathematical operating system running the show, humanity felt completely invincible, right? They assumed they had cracked the code and could just calculate their way to a perfect, frictionless future.
They absolutely did, and that assumption defined the 18th and 19th centuries. The mechanistic worldview of Descartes and Newton gave birth to the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason.
The era of endless optimism.
People looked at the predictable, flawless perfection of Newtonian physics, where planets move exactly where the math says they will, and assumed human society could be engineered in the exact same way. This generated a fervent, almost religious belief in the absolute inevitability of human progress.
The idea that if we just apply enough reason and enough science every day in every way, things are destined to get better and better. Poverty, disease, inequality, they were just mechanical errors we hadn't calculated how to fix yet.
Yes. But Van Doren points out a glaring historical paradox that exposed the flaw in this thinking.
What was the paradox?
The 18th century is famously defined by the American and French revolutions. Think about the sheer violence and chaos of those events.
Okay.
If social progress, liberty, and the advancement of human rights were truly inevitable, if they were driven by the mechanical, unstoppable laws of history, why did supposedly reasonable people have to fight, struggle, and die in horrific, bloody wars to force that progress into existence?
Oh man, that is a brilliant point. If the train of progress is moving on a predetermined mathematical track, you do not need to throw your body in front of it or wage a bloody revolution to make it arrive at the station.
Right.
The sheer messy violence of human history directly contradicts the idea that progress was a peaceful mathematical certainty.
Exactly. It reveals the deep inconsistencies in human affairs. We are not just mathematical equations. We're driven by pride, fear, and irrational desires.
We are definitely not frictionless gears in a clock.
No, we are not. And this crack in the facade of scientific certainty only widened as time went on. By the 20th century, the absolute arrogant confidence that science and mathematics could perfectly and completely explain all of reality completely broke down.
The computational OS finally started crashing.
Or, more accurately, we mathematically discovered the permanent limits of its programming. The book highlights a devastating mathematical proof published in the 1930s by an Austrian mathematician named Kurt Gödel.
Okay, Gödel, what did he prove?
Gödel demonstrated mathematically that within any logical system, no matter how perfectly structured it is, there will always be questions that simply cannot be answered with absolute certainty. There will always be truths that cannot be proven by the system itself.
Wait, slow down. I need to stop the train here. How do you use math to prove that math itself doesn't work perfectly? That sounds like a paradox.
It is a difficult concept, but think of it like a dictionary. Imagine you want to perfectly define every single word in a dictionary, but you are only allowed to use the words that are already inside that exact same dictionary.
Okay, I'm following.
Eventually, you will end up in a circular loop, using words to define words that define the first word. The system cannot perfectly validate itself from the inside.
Oh, wow.
Gödel proved something similar with mathematics. He proved that no mathematical system can be both perfectly complete, meaning it can prove every true statement, and perfectly consistent, meaning it contains no contradictions. If it is consistent, it will be incomplete.
So he proved, using the strictest logic possible, that there is a hard ceiling on what logic can actually achieve.
Precisely. The ultimate conclusion of the 20th century, as Van Doren writes, is that knowledge never can be perfectly certain. Our very effort to know fully and completely always gets in the way.
That's almost tragic.
The ancient Greek dream of a universe that perfectly and entirely fits human logic was proven impossible by our own advanced logic.
So, what does this all mean for us today? If Gödel proved we can never be 100% certain about the foundational rules of the universe, does that destroy the ancient dream of understanding? Or does it actually save us from the dangerous arrogance that Van Doren warned about earlier?
That's a profound way to look at it.
Does realizing our mathematical limits actually make us wiser?
That is the pivotal philosophical question of the modern age. And it is deeply complicated by a massive demographic shift that Van Doren highlights.
Which is?
For almost all of human history, as we discussed with the Mesopotamian scribes, the knowing classes, the literate, educated people who control the flow of information, were a tiny, elite fraction of the population.
The 1%.
Right.
Right.
But in the 20th and 21st centuries, thanks to mass education and digital media, the knowing classes became the vast majority of the population.
We're all scribes now.
We are. We all have instant access to the almost infinite amount of both general and particular knowledge right in our pockets. But we possess all of this information in an era where science itself admits that absolute foundational certainty is an illusion.
Which leaves us in a very strange, almost dizzying psychological position. We know vastly more than any humans in the history of the world, but we can never be entirely sure of any ultimate truth.
And that brings us to a final, highly provocative thought drawn from Van Doren's opening notes to the reader.
Okay, let's hear it.
He observes that human beings suffer from what he calls a disease of insatiable desire for knowledge. It is a thirst that is impossible to fully slake.
The more you know, the more you realize how much you do not know. The horizon just keeps moving further away.
Precisely. For our ancient ancestors, and for millions of people throughout history, the only effective cure for that insatiable disease, the only way to find peace with the vast, terrifying unknown, was faith.
Faith in what?
It was the grace of trusting in something beyond human understanding, whether that was theology, philosophy, or a belief in inevitable progress.
But now,
the knowing class is the majority of the planet, and absolute scientific certainty has been proven mathematically impossible. Van Doren asked, what will fill the void of faith?
That's a chilling question.
And if we apply that to our world right now, it leaves us with a fascinating question to ponder. In an era of AI and algorithmic certainty, are we actually returning to the days of the Mesopotamian scribes?
Oh, that's interesting.
Are we losing our general knowledge and just blindly putting our faith in a new class of digital elites and complex black box algorithms who read a code we no longer truly understand? Are we trading the pursuit of wisdom for the comfort of outsourced calculations?
That is a thought that will definitely linger, and it completely reframes everything we think we understand about our modern, hyper-connected world. Are we the enlightened masses, or just subjects of a new digital priesthood?
Something to really mull over.
Absolutely. Well, for full guides and resources, visit the TPT Google site and Patreon links in the description, or use YouTube if you prefer captions, playback speed controls, or multilingual support.